take a seed, you plant it, you grow it, you dry it, you roll it, you smoke it, and it goes down smooth. Hey!
Spanning the continent to bring you the truth about cannabis and marijuana law reform.
I smoke pot and I like it a lot.
The Russ Belville Show, the voice of the marijuana nation. Now, here's your host, Radical Russ Belville.
Well, on the earth, take a little seed, put it in the ground, it'll come back to me. The Mother Earth, she said by the sun.
Not turned on. It helps if the gain is turned up. There we go. We cleaned up the studio over the break, and so some knobs got adjusted. Sorry about that. Welcome to the show, everyone. Good day, tokers and tokettes and non-toking lovers of liberty. I'm Radical Russ Belville, coming to you from the edge of America's last absolute prohibition state, the gem state, the state of Idaho. And we've got plenty to cover on today's podcast. Coming up, we're going to talk a little bit in our Behind the Headlines segment about a terrible decision from the United States Supreme Court that is going to leave many people in prison who are convicted unfairly. I'll tell you all about that, and it affects the state right next to us, the state of Oregon. In our Pot and Public Policy segment, we're going to do a little red state roundup to show you how Idaho is getting left behind by all the other red states, southern states, midwestern states. Everybody's moving forward on legalizing marijuana except the state of Idaho. So we'll talk about that. Also coming up, we've got an anti-drug public service announcement from the Bangles, digging back into the 80s on that one. Also in the Radical Rant today, in our Hour 1, I'm going to talk about a trope in marijuana called the Jeckyll and Hyde effect that kind of illustrates, it's illustrated by a clip recently of Seth Rogen, the actor who appeared on a British morning television show and made a comment that really shocked them. I didn't find it that shocking. I don't think you will either, but I'll explain to you why they thought it was so shocking, something called the Jeckyll and Hyde trope. Of course, we start this first hour off with the Cannabis Headline Newsweek. Lots of news to cover from all across the United States and at the federal level with respect to marijuana law reform. That's coming up immediately after this introduction. And then stay tuned for Hour 2 in Toker Talk Radio, a really good show today because we're going to be taking a flashback 10 years ago to 2009 and my interview with the late Dr. Lester Grinspoon, Harvard emeritus professor, the author of Marijuana Reconsidered and so many other important books in drug law reform. We'll take a look back to 2009 and see how he was looking at marijuana reform at that time. You got to remember, we didn't even have any legal states back in 2009 and far fewer medical marijuana states. It's an interesting look back at 2009 with Dr. Lester Grinspoon. Also in Hour 2, we're going to be taking a look at cops and fentanyl. You may have heard, of course, fentanyl, the very powerful opioid. And lately, when law enforcement is called to arrest people for the possession of fentanyl, they're claiming that they're getting secondhand exposure to the fentanyl just from touching it, just from it being in the air. And then you see them coming in with the full gas masks and the protective gear. So we're going to punch some holes into that thinking coming up in Hour 2. Also, an interesting study on the effect of THC on lobsters. Yeah, I think I'm reading this right. The effect of THC on lobsters. Who would have even thought what lobsters would care about THC, but we're going to talk about that. So that's coming up on today's show. And some new polling. We got some polling from our neighbor state in Utah, where they are looking at marijuana law reform and some surprising numbers coming out of the Beehive state. We've got some numbers coming out of Pennsylvania as well in how their fight against marijuana reform is happening there. And some good news coming out of the Congress where the MORE Act has been reintroduced. This is breaking news here at the top of this hour. The MORE Act has been reintroduced. That's the Marijuana Opportunity Reinvestment and Expungement Act that would legalize marijuana at the federal level, taking it out of the Controlled Substances Act and letting the states set the policies as they see fit. But now, the news.
This is your Cannabis Headline News, brought to you every weekday by Radical Russ Radio at radicalruss.com. your 24-hour source for marijuana music and cannabis conversations. Subscribe today for just $4.20 at patreon.com/radicalruss. This is your Cannabis Headline News for the week ending Friday, May 28th, 2021. I'm Russ Belville. The governor of Minnesota on Tuesday signed a large-scale bill that includes provisions to expand the state's medical marijuana program, in part by allowing patients to access smokable cannabis products. Earlier this month, a bicameral conference committee approved the reform, in addition to several other marijuana-related changes, as part of an omnibus health bill. The full House and Senate then took it up and passed it last week, and now Governor Tim Walz has signed the measure. This comes after the House approved a bill to legalize marijuana for adult use following 12 committee assignments. That legislation stalled in the GOP-controlled Senate, however. There are few remaining states that have medical cannabis programs in place, but where smokable products are still prohibited. The Louisiana House approved a bill to allow access to flower products this session, and it's pending action on the Senate floor. In Alabama, the governor signed a medical marijuana legalization bill last week that includes a ban on smokable cannabis. The Louisiana Senate on Thursday approved a bill to give patients in the state's medical marijuana program the ability to legally smoke cannabis flower. The move, which comes a week after an effort to legalize marijuana more broadly in the state stalled in the House of Representatives, would mark a significant expansion to the current medical cannabis law if enacted. The legislation cleared the Senate by a vote of 26-11 after previously being approved by the House. It would have headed directly to the desk of Governor John Bel Edwards, but the body quickly brought the measure back up and added technical amendments, meaning it must first go back to the other chamber for concurrence. A bill to decriminalize marijuana possession in Louisiana that already passed the House was approved in a Senate committee on Tuesday, sending it to the full chamber for final passage. The legislation, sponsored by Representative Cedric Glover, would make it so possession of up to 14 grams of cannabis would be punishable by a $100 fine without the threat of jail time. It cleared the Senate Judiciary C Committee in a 3-2 vote. If the decriminalization bill is approved on the Senate floor without amendments, it will head to the governor's desk. This development comes as Louisiana lawmakers consider a number of separate marijuana bills this session, including one that would allow patients to access smokable cannabis products. That measure has also passed the House and is pending action on the Senate floor. A complementary bill to tax flower marijuana is also set to be taken up by the Senate. The Nevada Assembly on Thursday approved a bill to legalize marijuana consumption lounges, and a California bill that would allow local jurisdictions to permit licensed cannabis lounges to sell non-marijuana foods and drinks also cleared that state's assembly. Both pieces of legislation now head to the Senate in their respective states. In Nevada, the measure from Assemblyman Steve Yeager cleared the chamber on a 29-12 vote. It would create 2 new licensing categories for cannabis businesses in the state. One would be for retail cannabis consumption lounges, and the other would be an independent cannabis consumption lounge. Existing retailers could apply for the former license and sell products that could be consumed on-site by adults 21 and older. Independent lounges would not be permitted to sell cannabis on their own, but would need to have marijuana products delivered to consumers from another source. Missourians voted to legalize medical marijuana in 2018, but under federal law, growing, transporting, or selling marijuana remains a crime. Unsurprisingly, that dynamic has created a lot of headaches for the fledgling industry. One notable example, unlike every other legal business in the state, marijuana companies are prohibited from deducting business expenses on their taxes. Missouri lawmakers took a step toward easing some of that burden during the recently concluded legislative session. While federal law remains unchanged, a bill allowing medical marijuana companies to deduct ordinary and necessary business expenses on their state tax returns won near unanimous approval and was sent to the governor. The bill now awaits Governor Mike Parson's signature or veto. The measure, if enacted, would not change the federal 280E provision that remains in effect against cannabis businesses. A joint Maine House and Senate committee on Tuesday advanced a bill to broadly decriminalize possession of illicit drugs and another measure to reform the state's drug trafficking laws, but the panel members were split on how the legislature should handle the decriminalization proposal going forward. The first piece of legislation, LD 967, would make illicit drug possession a civil violation, punishable by a fine of up to $100. People would be able to avoid that penalty if they submit to, quote, an evidence-based assessment for proposed treatment for substance use disorder, end quote. Two Democratic senators, who were among the initial no votes, submitted a report recommending that the legislature should pass the measure, but it should be revised. They want to make it so a second possession offense would mandate the assessment in addition to the fine. Third and subsequent offenses should be criminal misdemeanors, they argued. The Republican members of the panel issued a report saying the bill should not be passed. Legislation revamping Illinois' system for awarding marijuana dispensary licenses passed the House on Tuesday. The measure is meant to address shortcomings in the 2019 Cannabis Regulation and Tax Act, specifically in regard to a license lottery that was delayed by the pandemic, controversy, and legal disputes for over a year. Amendments to House Bill 1443, sponsored by Chicago Democratic Representative LaShawn Ford, would create two new marijuana dispensary lotteries offering 55 licenses each, while addressing lingering concerns regarding the original 75 licenses established in the 2019 law. The 75 licenses initially set by the 2019 law were supposed to be granted by May 2020, but were sidelined by the outbreak of the COVID-19 pandemic. They were later delayed again following backlash over how applicants for the licenses were scored, and pushed back a third time following lawsuits against the state by the finalists of the initial lottery after Governor J.B. Pritzker announced applications that did not meet the cut could be edited and rescored. According to new polling released Tuesday by the U.S. Cannabis Council, 66% of Utahns surveyed, quote, support federal cannabis legalization generally, end quote. Support was higher among voters surveyed in West Virginia, 70%, and Arizona, 72%, two more traditionally conservative states. It's becoming difficult to find anyone anywhere who supports continuing adult marijuana prohibition. Recent surveys by Pew Research show only 8% of Americans support an absolute marijuana prohibition, like Idaho's. According to Quinnipiac University, even people over age 65, the last holdouts against legalization, now support it by 51%. An Illinois House committee on Thursday approved a blistering resolution condemning the war on drugs and its discriminatory impact on communities of color. The House Human Services Committee adopted the measure, which has the short title of Shameful History, War on Drugs. It's now been placed on the calendar for floor consideration. It starts with the history of the drug war under the Nixon administration, calling it a, quote, failed, costly, and inhumane effort that would, quote, prove to be the United States' longest and costliest war and ultimately a complete and shameful failure, end quote. What's more, the real enemies that President Richard Nixon targeted, quote, were not drug abusers, but were the anti-war left and black Americans, end quote, the measure states. The drug war fueled mass incarceration, it continues, noting that one factor that's led to a more recent decline in the male prison population seems to be states and local municipalities moving to legalize or decriminalize marijuana. The governor of Pennsylvania on Wednesday pardoned a doctor who was arrested, prosecuted, and jailed for growing marijuana that he used to provide relief for his dying wife. The daughter of 65-year-old Paul Ezell also faced a conviction and lost her license to be a nurse because she was at the house when police seized the plants in 2014. The State Board of Pardons will vote on whether to make her eligible for gubernatorial clemency next month. Quote, here's a doctor of 30 years who had not so much as a speeding ticket, and then his whole life is ruined for giving his wife medicine that's now legal in Pennsylvania, Lieutenant Governor John Fetterman, who helped bring attention to the case, said in a press release. Quote, this is a prime example of the destructive power of reefer madness, end quote. Governor Tom Wolf has pardoned 96 people with cannabis convictions to date as part of the expedited review program for nonviolent marijuana-related offenses through the Board of Pardons. The Democratic governor of Delaware says he remains opposed to legalizing marijuana for adult use, in part because he believes that cannabis can be a gateway to other drugs in certain cases. During an interview with WHYY and Delaware Public Media on Monday, Governor John Carney was pressed on the fact that neighboring states are pursuing cannabis reform and was asked whether his long-standing opposition to legalization had waned in light of that regional shift.
Look, I just don't think it's a good idea. And I spent 8 years as lieutenant governor, spending a lot of time trying to convince Delawareans to live a healthier lifestyle. So we spend all this time and money to get people to stop smoking cigarettes, and now we want to say it's okay to smoke marijuana recreationally. And if you talk to the parents of some of these folks that have overdosed and passed away, they don't think it's a good idea because they remember the trajectory of their own sons and daughters.
When pressed, Carney declined to say whether he would sign or veto a bill to legalize cannabis in Delaware that's moving through the legislature, though he said the proposal is, quote, a bad idea, end quote. The Wyoming Supreme Court has censured a Cheyenne attorney for allowing a Division of Criminal Investigation agent to make false testimony during a 2020 case in which law enforcement sought to prosecute hemp farmers as marijuana traffickers. DCI Special Agent John Briggs, the lead investigator in the case, falsely testified about a critical exchange with one of the defendants that occurred when officers stormed the operation outside Albin, the Supreme Court found. During the November 2019 raid, Brock Dyke, a contract farmer, provided Briggs with test results indicating that the crop was legal. But in an initial July 2020 hearing, Briggs testified that he remembered Dyke's test as possibly showing the hemp to be above the legal THC limit. The prosecutor, Laramie County's Senior Assistant District Attorney David Singleton, made no effort to correct the testimony. Singleton admitted to violating the Wyoming judiciary's rules of protection. A new federal report is again challenging the prohibitionist narrative that state-level marijuana legalization leads to increased youth use. This time, the U.S. Department of Education's National Center for Education Statistics analyzed youth surveys of high school students from 2009 to 2019, concluding that there's been, quote, no measurable difference in the percentage of those in grades 9 through 12 who reported consuming cannabis at least once in the past 30 days. The report, which relies on data from the Youth Risk Behavior Surveillance System, also found that access remained stable during that time period, with no statistically significant changes in the percentage of youth who say they've been offered, sold, or gifted illegal drugs on school grounds in the past 30 days. Further, there was, quote, no measurable difference between 2009 and 2019 in the percentage of students who reported that illegal drugs were made available to them on school property, end quote, the center said. States that have legalized marijuana for adult use have collectively generated nearly $8 billion in tax revenue from cannabis since legal sales first began in 2014, according to a new report from the Marijuana Policy Project. The analysis examined the tax structure and revenue streams of all 18 states that have legalized recreational cannabis, though sales have not yet launched in 7 of those states. Overall, it shows that establishing regulated marijuana markets gives states a steady and generally growing source of revenue that can support various programs and services. Last year alone, the adult use states collected $2.7 billion in taxes from cannabis sales. And as more markets come online and others mature, that's expected to continue to grow. The report does not factor in local tax revenue that individual municipalities may impose on cannabis sales, like in Denver, where residents pay an additional 5.5% tax that has generated hundreds of thousands of dollars for the city. A congresswoman is asking the federal government to stop kicking people out of public housing for using marijuana in states where it is legal. Representative Eleanor Holmes Norton on Tuesday sent a letter to the head of the Department of Housing and Urban Development, imploring her to use executive discretion to not enforce policies that prohibit cannabis use in federally assisted housing in states that have enacted legalization. The congresswoman wrote to HUD Secretary Marcia Fudge 2 weeks after filing legislation that would legislatively accomplish the same objective. Quote, HUD, like DOJ, should not enforce marijuana laws where states have taken action to legalize marijuana, she said. Smoking marijuana in federally assisted housing should be treated in the same manner as smoking tobacco in federally assisted housing, end quote. As the average age of farmers in the U.S. continues to increase, hemp legalization is exciting a younger generation about working in agriculture, Senate Finance Committee Chairman Ron Wyden said.
We've seen a lot of young farmers get very interested in hemp. And at a time when the age of farmers in America keeps going up and up, to have all these young farmers interested and coming back to the farm because they see so much potential, here. I just said, we're on the right side of history. Look at all these young farmers coming back to ag.
But while the domestic hemp market has rapidly expanded since prohibition was lifted, regulatory policies continue to hold back cannabis businesses. Specifically, the lack of Food and Drug Administration rules to allow hemp-derived CBD to be marketed as food or dietary supplements is at issue. This has been your Cannabis Headline News for the week ending Friday, May 28th, 2021. I'm Russ Belville. Cannabis Headline News is heard at the top of every hour on Radical Russ Radio, and Friday's news is contained within the free Russ Belville Show live podcast. For daily downloads of Cannabis Headline News podcast to your device every morning, subscribe by becoming a patron of Radical Russ Radio. And a big thanks to my patrons out there at patreon.com/radicalruss. Couple new folks have signed on to get the daily Cannabis Headline News and the weekly Toker Talk Radio. Really appreciate all the support. Hey, all right, that sound means that it's 4:20 here in the Mountain Time Zone. That means it's time for us to take our union-mandated safety briefing. It's very important that we stay safe, especially in America's last absolute prohibition state. Make sure you know which way downwind is if you get my drift. Be right back. It's time for Idaho to join the rest of the nation in legalizing medical marijuana. The volunteers at Kind Idaho have proposed the Idaho Medical Marijuana Act and are collecting signatures now to place it on the ballot. Visit kindidaho.org to learn more. Become a volunteer signature gatherer for Kind Idaho to help collect the over 65,000 signatures needed to put medical marijuana on the November 2022 ballot. Polls show it will pass. Please visit kindidaho.org today.
You're not high. You're listening to the Russ Belville Show.
We can do a lot of privatizations and private prisons. It seems to work a lot better.
Okay, maybe you're high, too.
And now, a brief glimpse into the future. No way, Grandpa. You're a liar.
You better watch your tone, Squirt. No, I'm not lying. Back when I was your age, policemen would come and dig this up.
The community garden? Why, Grandpa?
Because those flowers there were illegal.
How can flowers be illegal?
Anything can be illegal if enough people say so.
Aren't those the flowers you and Grandma grow for medicine?
That's right. Do you remember the name?
Cannabis.
Good job. But back then, they called it marijuana. And when we were young, if anybody knew you were growing marijuana, the police could come and break down your door and take you away to prison, sometimes for the rest of your life.
Oh, no! Grandpa, they're not going to take you and Grandma away, are they?
No, Squirt. Enough people decided a long time ago that flowers shouldn't be illegal anymore.
Oh, that's good. Making flowers illegal was dumb.
It sure was, Squirt. It sure was.
This has been a look into the future.
The world of cannabis is evolving at a frenetic pace. The Russ Belville Show gets behind the headlines to take a deeper look at breaking news in our Cannabis Focus.
Well, today in the Cannabis Focus, I want to take a look at our criminal justice system, specifically in the state of Oregon and the state of Louisiana. And it has to do with how these two states convict people given their right to a jury trial. Under the United States Constitution, of course, we have a right to a jury of our peers to judge us in any criminal matter. That's in the Sixth Amendment. And you would think, and if you follow crime shows, if you've ever seen court dramas, you probably know how it goes, right? The 12 angry men sit in the room, or angry men and women now, of course, sit in the room and deliberate the guilt or innocence of the defendant. And when all 12 of them come to a decision, then they are declared either not guilty or guilty. Right? Unanimous decision. You always hear about this. And we talk about it in the context of jury nullification as well, where if just one person on a jury decides that someone should not be convicted of a crime, then that entire jury is hung. They can't come to a decision, and the defendant is let free until another trial is convened. So this is something we talk a lot about in marijuana reform, the idea of jury nullification, so that when people are brought up on marijuana charges, if someone disagrees with the fact that marijuana is illegal, they can vote not to convict, even if there's a signed confession, even if there's videotape, if there's 100 eyewitnesses,
If one juror decides not to convict, that is jury nullification, and that person goes free. Except in the states of Oregon and Louisiana. So there's a little catch we need to talk about here called non-unanimous juries. When the state of Oregon was put together out of the Oregon Territory, there was a lot of influence from the Ku Klux Klan at the time. And also in the South, during Reconstruction, we had a situation where newly freed African-American men, because women still hadn't had the right to vote yet, but newly freed African-American men could serve on juries and could vote. And this led the states of Louisiana and Oregon to set up a jury system by which people could be convicted by either an 11-to-1 jury or a 10-to-2 jury. These are known as non-unanimous jury convictions. And only Louisiana and Oregon and the territory of Puerto Rico have had them since 1972. Back in 1972, the Supreme Court ruled that a non-unanimous jury conviction was unconstitutional. It was a violation of that Sixth Amendment right to have a jury of your peers unanimously decide that you are guilty or innocent. But there was kind of a loophole that Oregon and Louisiana managed to work under, and Puerto Rico managed to work under, to allow them to continue with this non-unanimous jury process. Well, in 2020, the court finally closed those loopholes. So last year, Louisiana, Oregon, and Puerto Rico finally had to begin convicting people with unanimous juries. Now, these non-unanimous juries, of course, were holdover from Jim Crow, from the Ku Klux Klan, wanting to invalidate the vote of the one or two black people who would get selected to serve on a particular jury. So since 2020, since last year, Oregon, Louisiana, and Puerto Rico have finally had to stop this practice. But that left another question. What do you do with all the people who were already convicted by a 10-to-2 or an 11-to-1 jury? This came up last week in a case called Edwards versus Vinoy. And this was a case where someone who was previously convicted in Oregon by a non-unanimous jury was suing for a retrial to have his rights respected and to finally get a unanimous jury to decide whether or not he was guilty of what he was accused of. So our Attorney General in Oregon, Ellen Rosenblum, argued before the Supreme Court that these people, that this Vinoy and by Edwards, and by extension, everyone else in the same circumstance, because this is the way this works, right? If one person sues for this and wins, well, then that opens up the floodgates for everyone else. So Oregon's Attorney General, Ellen Rosenblum, argued to the Supreme Court that Oregon, quote, has a compelling interest in the finality of its convictions, end quote. And that if we let this guy get a retrial and everyone else who was tried by a non-unanimous jury get a retrial, that retroactivity would, quote, have a significant impact on crime victims and requires retrials years after the fact when key evidence may be gone, end quote. So basically, Oregon's Attorney General is saying, hey, look, we got a whole bunch of guilty people that we put in jail under these non-unanimous juries, and if we had to retry them all, that would take forever. And in a lot of these cases, we don't have the evidence anymore, or the people that testified are dead, or their memories have faded, or whatever might have happened, but we might not be able to retry these people. So the Supreme Court last week came back and in a 6-3 decision agreed with Attorney General Rosenblum. Justice Kavanaugh wrote the majority decision. Now, what this means is that these people who were convicted under Jim Crow juries that the Supreme Court has already agreed are unconstitutional, that has forbidden any future defendants from being convicted by these unfair juries. But for all of you who are already convicted, oh well, gee whiz, tough nuts. You're not going to get a retrial. And that's just disgusting. One of the justices Justice Elena Kagan, who was with the 3 justices that were opposed to this ruling, wrote that, quote, "For the first time in many decades, those convicted under rules found not to produce fair and reliable verdicts will be left without recourse in federal courts." This is one of the few areas now. I mean, in other circumstances, for example, if you find a prosecutor was engaged in prosecutorial misconduct, those people that were prosecuted by that prosecutor can get retrials. We had the case that we've told you about out of Massachusetts, where the crime lab tech who was working there admitted to falsifying the results of various drug tests in the crime lab, and they had to go over a couple thousand convictions that had to do with this woman's work at the crime lab. Those people are getting retrials. Those people are getting a new shot at justice. But the people of Oregon, Louisiana, and Puerto Rico, who from 1972 to 2020 had been convicted by a 10-2 or 11-1 jury, they just got the door slammed in their face by this 6-3 Supreme Court decision along conservative lines. And it just goes to show, for those people out there who refuse to vote, refuse to register, to get involved, and when we talk about how important it is because there's a Supreme Court and there's appointments to the Supreme Court that matter, and now we're seeing how those appointments matter. This is fully a political decision, with the 6 conservative justices ruling that people's rights really don't matter that much. And what the heck, 10-2, that's close enough. Close enough for government work, right? It's just someone's liberty. It's just someone losing their family, their job, their livelihood, years off their life because of something that's been declared unfair, unconstitutional, and now declared just, it's just too much hassle. It's just too much work. And I'm not surprised that you'd get a 6-3 decision like this out of the Supreme Court. What I am surprised is Attorney General Ellen Rosenblum of the state of Oregon, a Democrat, arguing. Now, I understand she's got to argue from the point of view of the Justice Department there in Oregon, and they don't want to have to retry all those cases. It's a fiscal issue for them. But it would be nice for once just to have some of these politicians stand up for people's rights, especially people's rights who are downtrodden, people who've been convicted, people who are in prison and don't have the kind of resources necessarily to lobby for a bill like this or to lobby for a law to change this situation. And now they're stuck. We're just going to throw those people's lives away and never give them a new chance. Never give them a real chance to overcome the discriminatory practice that came from Jim Crow, came from the Reconstruction era, came from the minds of the Ku Klux Klan. It would just be too much hassle. You can find my write-up on that story on the blog at radicalruss.com. Got links to the decisions as well. But really, how much more offensive could it be? Let people languish in a prison that were convicted unfairly. Because, close enough, right? Stay tuned. When we come back, we're going to take a look at public policy. What's happening in the rest of the red states as Idaho continues to hang on to prohibition. Radio, content for the cannabis community. Hi, I'm Radical Russ Belville, the sole producer of this 24-hour marijuana music and cannabis conversation stream I call Radical Russ Radio. As part of my mission to educate and entertain people about the need to end adult marijuana prohibition, I produce the Russ Belville Show podcast every week, available absolutely free wherever you get your podcasts. For those of you who'd like to help support my mission financially, you can become a Radical Russ Radio VIP at patreon.com/radicalruss or by clicking the link for Toker Talk Radio in the main menu. For just $4.20 a month, VIPs will receive the exclusive download of Hour 2 of my podcast, Toker Talk Radio, every week, as well as the 5-minute cannabis headline news every weekday. Upgrade to the $14.20 a month tier, and you'll get those podcasts and a set of custom patriotic pro-marijuana stickers from me every quarter. And if you can afford to support Radical Russ Radio at $44.20 a month, you get my podcast, and each quarter you receive a poster, then a mug, then a t-shirt, and finally a hoodie that proclaim your support for ending adult marijuana prohibition. I literally cannot do this without you. Your support enables me to continue my life's work, and I thank you for it. Visit patreon.com/radicalruss and become a Radical Russ Radio VIP today. Marijuana legalization is just the beginning of a process of restoring our natural rights to the cannabis plant. Join us now as we learn more about the rules, regulations, and court decisions that are shaping the landscape of legal marijuana in this edition of Pot Public Policy. It's been pretty amazing over the past few weeks watching the headlines as they appear at marijuanamoment.net, covering the various states as they engage in marijuana law reform. And it's not the typical names we're used to hearing of the West Coast and the Northeast and the Great Lakes states, but instead states in the South and the Intermountain West that are moving forward as Idaho still stubbornly clings to absolute marijuana prohibition. We look immediately to the southeast of Idaho and the state of Utah. Utah, of all places, probably the state most closely aligned with the state of Idaho, religiously, culturally, economically, politically. And in the state of Utah, there was a survey that just came out. This was sponsored by the U.S. Cannabis Council, new business-oriented lobbying group headed up on an interim basis by the current director of the Marijuana Policy Project. And the poll asked Utahns, West Virginians, and Arizonans what they thought of federal cannabis legalization. And the results coming out of all three of these very red conservative states are supermajority support for legalization. Over 2/3 support in red states. The figure coming out of the state of Utah, 66% support for federal cannabis legalization. West Virginia, 70% support. Arizona, 72% support. So I don't know what Idaho is waiting for. We're still looking to get some polls out of the state of Idaho on marijuana legalization generally. We know the medical support is over 70%. So we've got Utah at 66%, I think bodes well for the state of Idaho and what it would poll at were those people to be asked. And it's becoming increasingly difficult to find anyone, anywhere, of any age, of any demographic that supports marijuana prohibition like Idaho has. The recent surveys by Pew Research show that only 8% of Americans support absolute marijuana prohibition. And by that we mean no medical, no legalization. Absolute prohibition. Anybody that's got weed on them gets busted. Only 8% of Americans support that. And according to Quinnipiac University's polls, even for people over the age of 65, the support is at 51%. And that was the last demographic. It's always been that last cohort of baby boomers that remained in support for prohibition has finally fallen off. You now have to go as high as 75 years old before you find people that have a majority support for marijuana prohibition. And we're seeing this all across the United States. Most recently, we saw in Louisiana, the governor there, the Senate there has passed a bill approving smokable medical marijuana. And in Minnesota, the governor has signed the bill allowing for smokable medical marijuana. And this is significant because as medical marijuana has progressed across the United States, it's kind of been going backwards. Years ago, I coined a theory called the Box Canyon theory. And the way that it went was, if you only fight for medical marijuana, eventually your marijuana will only be medical. The idea being that we had to take the time, and this, we started this theory way back in 2010, that we have to take the time to fight for legalization itself and stop allowing there to be an excuse for your use of marijuana. You don't have to have an excuse. You don't have to have anyone's approval. You're an adult. But if we continued to just say you had to have an excuse and it was only medical, well, then we'd see situations like what happened with medical marijuana, where the first few states to get medical marijuana were very open and liberal, like California. Any condition will do. If a doctor says you can have it, you can have it, and we're not going to care too much about how much you got. But as time went on, the medical marijuana laws got more restrictive. Oh, you have to have a certain qualifying condition. You have to pick one off this specific list. You can only have so much marijuana. Then the laws got even more restrictive, saying, oh, no, you can't grow your own marijuana. You have to buy it from a store. And then the laws got more restrictive even further, as some of the states started saying, oh, you can't have raw cannabis flower. You can't have the smokable medical marijuana, which to me is a betrayal of the term medical marijuana. I think when people hear the term medical marijuana, they think marijuana being used medically. They don't think of pharmaceuticalized marijuana, which is what I call those states that don't allow smokable flower. If you're only allowing me some preparation of cannabis that's been processed into some kind of pill, spray, or inhaler, then you're doing the same thing Big Pharma does. You're just taking a raw ingredient, adding cost to it, and profit to it. We want the raw flower to be able to use as we choose. So this development of Minnesota and Louisiana, two of the states that passed these very tentative, non-smokable medical marijuana laws, relenting and allowing for smokable cannabis flower, shows that we are out of the medical marijuana box canyon. We've escaped the box canyon now. The medical laws are getting more liberal. Ones that are already established and conservative are opening up. We're seeing it in Texas, where they started with a medical marijuana law that was really just a CBD oil law that allowed THC up to 0.5%. They're going to let that go up to 5%. They're going to increase by a factor of 10 the potency of THC in their medical marijuana in Texas. So we are seeing changes all throughout these red states that so timidly embraced the very least medical marijuana they can embrace, are now opening it up more, adding more conditions, making it easier for people to qualify. We're seeing this in Alabama, where the governor there has signed a medical marijuana law. So even southern states now are moving forward, as Idaho still stays behind, clinging desperately to this adult marijuana prohibition. And it's not just marijuana that's happening now. We've got some of these conservative states that are starting to look at MDMA, at psilocybin mushrooms, at all sorts of psychedelics. In Louisiana, there's a marijuana decriminalization bill. In Texas, they're looking at a psychedelics bill. And let's not forget Florida. Florida is another one of those states that passed medical marijuana. And then after it was passed, the legislature came back and said, oh no, you can't smoke flower. We can't have smokable flower. And finally, after a couple of years now, Florida has moved forward and allowed people to have smokable cannabis flower. So the medical marijuana laws are getting more liberal, even in these red states. Which leads us to wonder, what is it the state of Idaho thinks that it's holding on for? What secret do Idaho politicians know that they don't understand in Tennessee or Alabama or Texas or any of these red states that are moving forward? We're seeing states all across this country that are making progress, while Idaho still sits in the 1980s. And coming up in hour 2, I'm going to tell you another story about that as well. Our favorite state senator in the state of Idaho, C. Scott Grow, the ironically named C. Scott Grow, I met a friend of his. So I'm going to tell you about that in hour 2, about how these people think about marijuana and what it's going to take to change their minds. People ask me often what they think is holding up marijuana legalization in Idaho, and it's pretty simple. It's reefer madness. Really, Idaho is one of the few places left where they actually believe the gateway drug theory, and that marijuana causes homelessness somehow, and that the embrace of marijuana legalization is going to beset your community with all the problems you'd find in a community 10 times the size on the coast, right? They still believe those things. And there's also kind of a political mindset in the state of Idaho that Idaho is what America was. And they mean that in a positive way. They see Idaho as holding on to the traditional values of America, however you think those traditional values may be. And they see marijuana as non-traditional, as violating those traditional values. Some of that is religious, is a religious concern. They think it's immoral to be using cannabis. For many of them, it's a drug, and drugs are drugs, and all drugs are bad, and you shouldn't use drugs. Of course, they don't seem to notice that alcohol is a drug, but that's a whole nother rant. Speaking of rants, we're going to take a break, and when we come back, we'll finish out the hour with a look at the mind of the prohibitionist and what they actually think marijuana does to us. Stick around. You're listening to the Russ Belville Show, Idaho's marijuana podcast on RadicalRuss.com. Radical Russ here for the Idaho Citizens Coalition for Cannabis. Since 2010, the members of the Idaho Citizens Coalition have been fighting to legalize marijuana in America's last absolute prohibition state. We believe Idahoans deserve legal access to the cannabis plant in all of its forms. Find out more about the Idaho Citizens Coalition at idahocan.co. That's idahocann.co. And find us on Facebook at IdahoCan.
In the interest of fair and balanced journalism, the Russ Belville Show presents the anti-drug public service announcement of the day.
I wanted to save you, and I can't. And you had to do it yourself.
Once just staying off drugs for a few days and starting to see how it was and actually working towards that, things are not perfect and it's not always easy, but it's
sure
nothing
better
like
than it was.
That's for sure.
Just another manic Monday.
This has been the Russ Belville Show's anti-drug public service announcement of the day, exclusively on RadicalRuss.com.
We must wage what I have called total war against public enemy number one.
I support a change in law to end federal criminal penalties for possession of up to 1 ounce of marijuana.
That marijuana, pot, grass, whatever you want to call it, is probably the most dangerous drug.
Some think there won't be room for them in jail. We'll make room.
I experimented with marijuana a time or two, and I didn't like it and didn't inhale.
One major responsibility is to encourage people to use less drugs.
Entirely legitimate topic for debate.
Radical Rant.
What is it that you people think marijuana smoking does to us anyway? That's the question that's on my mind as I was flipping through Twitter the other day, and I came upon a tweet that was going viral involving Seth Rogen. And, you know, Seth Rogen, the actor from so many different movies, who's well known as a cannabis consumer and now has his own cannabis brand, Houseplant. The comment had to do with cancel culture and basically Seth Rogen saying, look, if you're a comedian, you said something awful a bunch of years ago, just admit it. Don't say you're getting canceled. Just accept that, hey, you know, times are different. I said something bad. I'm sorry, and let's move on. That's what went viral from a conversation he was having with Good Morning Britain. And that was followed up with another tweet, and that's the one I want to get to because it has to do with the host there of Good Morning Britain speaking to Seth Rogen and talking to him about his cannabis brand and his cannabis use, and they're incredulous. They can't believe that he's a regular cannabis consumer. Let me just give you the clip here. Let's see if this will play for you.
I mean, drugs, you're very honest about it, but you smoke cannabis, smoke marijuana every day?
I do all day, every day. I have for the last 25 years or so, I would say. Yeah, I would. Yeah, it's something that is, intrinsic to my day-to-day functionality.
Well, no wonder you go to bed early.
Exactly. I also wake up early, though.
See, and there's a joking tone, a laughing tone to it, but really what you can hear behind the question, and of course, when you're watching the video, you can see their facial expressions as well, is that they seem just genuinely shocked that someone could be an articulate, accomplished person and smoke marijuana all the time. Now, I've thought about this quite a bit because I'm like Seth Rogen, although I've got 5 more years on him. For about the past 30 years, I've been smoking marijuana damn near every day and many times each day. You got the joint in the morning, you got a midday joint. You know what I'm saying? I could consume anywhere between 2 and 3.5 grams a day. Easily. So people are shocked when you admit that to them. They can't, and oftentimes you get, at least I can say from my own personal experience, you get a feeling like, oh, well, you can do it. Like, oh, it's different for you. You're special somehow. But most people wouldn't be able to do that, right? Well, I'm here to tell you that most of us regular cannabis consumers are just like Seth Rogen. Cannabis is a part of our day, and really, it's no more like our multiple time use a day is no more shocking to us than this TV host drinking 2 cups of coffee to start the day, getting a top off through the mid-morning on his coffee. Maybe he has a Coke at lunch, right? Nobody considers that, crazed drug use that should somehow stop the host from being a accomplished, articulate, successful person. And so the only thing I can imagine is that in their imagination, they must think marijuana is going to do something much worse than what it does. And I've broken it down to what I think are 3 types of squares on this issue. Your first type of square, and these are pretty rare, is your teetotaler. The one who's never smoked pot, they've never drank alcohol, they've never touched a mind-altering substance in their life, and they've got no experience with it whatsoever. But they have seen people drink. And they've seen people get drunk. And they've seen the terrible, belligerent, obnoxious, puke on your shoes, get in a fight, slap your woman type of drunks out there. And so they must think, well, that's the legal drug. And so illegal drugs must be worse than that, right? That's what I figure a teetotaler thinks of daily marijuana use. The next type would be your drinkers, right? And that would be most of them out there. And I don't mean like they're alcoholics or anything, but the kind of people who have a beer now and then, maybe a 6-pack on the weekend, right? So they've never smoked pot, but they do drink alcohol. And in their mind, alcohol is not a big deal because they drink it and they get along just fine. But they don't drink it all day, every day. And they know some people who do drink it all day, every day. And they're terrible people whose personalities change when they're drunk and they do all the terrible things. So if that's the legal drug, illegal drugs must be worse than that. But they're not even the worst of the squares out there. The worst square out there is the one-toke Todd. One-toke Todd. The guy, he doesn't drink or smoke, or maybe he does drink. But he smoked pot way back in the day in high school or college, and it didn't work for him. He got sick, or he got paranoid, or he got anxious, or whatever. And so that person, the one-toke Todd, thinks that's what's going to happen to you if you smoke pot, or you're going to turn out like the people he smoked pot with, and maybe they didn't turn out so well. So that's what I think's going on, is the squares don't have any real understanding of what it's like to be an all-day, everyday cannabis consumer. And so they can't understand that marijuana is not altering our lifestyle, it's enhancing it. Like Seth Rogen said, it's intrinsic to my lifestyle. My friend Ngaio Belam, the comedian, he calls it the ranch dressing of life. He says marijuana is the ranch dressing of life because, like ranch dressing, it makes everything you add it to a little better. For us, it's the morning joint, the mid-morning toke, the afternoon bong hit. Just makes life a little better. So sometimes when I bring this up to people, they'll push back a bit. They'll say, oh, come on, Russ. A cup of coffee isn't mind-altering like pot is. You know, the all-day coffee drinker isn't mind-altering like the all-day pot smoker. But look, for those of us who take in grams per day of pot, it doesn't have a serious mind-altering effect either. Like, do you know someone who, if they haven't had their morning cup of coffee, is impossible to be around? A total grouch, just terrible? What do you think that coffee's doing for them, if not altering their mind somehow? So yes, coffee can be mind-altering. Any of these stimulants can be mind-altering. But the thing about the marijuana, especially if you use it to a great extent like I do or like Seth Rogen does, is that we've got a tolerance to this. See, I can function if I don't have marijuana in my day, but I'm a bit like that guy who hasn't had his coffee in the day. You know, like the Snickers commercial, you know, you're not yourself, right? I mean, I'm not melting into the couch. I'm not covered in Cheetos dust. I'm not unable to perform simple tasks of memory or suffering from any radical change to my personality. We all have an endocannabinoid system. And for those of us that consume often, who's to say that we don't have an imbalance in our endocannabinoid system and that we need to supplement our endocannabinoid system with phytocannabinoids, with plant-based cannabis? People like Seth Rogen, people like me that are consuming cannabis every day do develop this tolerance. And it's not just conjecture. This is something that the federal government agrees with me on. The federal government has a Schedule III substance called Marinol. It's a synthetic THC pill. And that synthetic THC pill, it gets you high, folks, let me tell you. So back in the day when I was married, my ex-wife, she was on the Oregon medical marijuana program, but she still had a job that required drug testing. And as you probably know, just because your state has medical marijuana doesn't mean that you won't get fired for failing a drug test. So my wife, like many people, even in legal marijuana states or illegal states for that matter, got by with what's known as the Marinol loophole. See, if you get yourself a prescription for Marinol, the synthetic THC, you can get a pass on your workplace drug test. Because the simple workplace drug test they use for pre-employment or random screening detects the metabolites of THC and is not sophisticated enough to detect whether that metabolite came from a synthetic THC molecule like Marinol or a natural THC molecule like cannabis. So if you have that federal prescription for Marinol, many workplaces will give you a pass if you fail your workplace drug testing for THC. So she got this prescription for Marinol and never used it. I mean, she filled it. She got the little bottle of Marinol pills, but never actually took them. Because the medical marijuana, the plant-based marijuana, works so much better. But that bottle of pills sat in our fridge for a while. And I thought it might be interesting to see what the difference was between Marinol and marijuana. Now, these were the 5 milligram dosage. They go as high as 20. So this is the lowest dosage milligram you can get of Marinol. And I took one. And you know me, I'm a regular cannabis consumer, right? I have never had a worse trip on THC than I had with that Marinol pill. It was awful. All the terrible things they tell you about marijuana, the people that don't like it, oh, it made me paranoid, it made me anxious. That's what happened to me under a Marinol pill, partially because Marinol has no CBD. So it doesn't cut any of the psychoactivity, but also it has none of the other phytocannabinoids or anything else of a cannabis plant that helps give you the balance.
And that Marinol pill, its bottle says, until you know how Marinol may affect you, do not drive or operate heavy machinery, which means once you know how it affects you, feel free to drive. So even the government admits that we develop a tolerance. All right, that's all the time we got for Hour 1. Thanks for joining us. For everyone here in America's absolute prohibition state, I'm Radical Russ. Thanks for joining us, and until next time, take care of each other, tokers.
Try it to ruin it, you smoke it and it goes down smooth.